into what's happening. And then we'll proceed with testimonies and evidence from a number of other people to give you an understanding of what is happening and the persecution that Ahmadi Muslims are suffering. My name is Edward Davey. I'm leader of the Liberal Democrats in the United Kingdom. But more importantly, I'm a member of the all-party party group in the House of Commons in Westminster. That's a cross-party group trying to campaign on behalf of Ahmadi Muslims. In our work, we've heard time and time again about the persecution Ahmadi Muslims suffer around the world for no reason other than their faith. The source of much of this persecution comes from Pakistan, where Ahmadis face state-sponsored persecution through legislation which prohibits them from, and I quote, indirectly or directly posing as a Muslim. And what's even more worrying over the history of this persecution is that recently there's been a major escalation in the persecution of Ahmadis. We're seeing the Ahmadis being digitally policed. We're seeing attacks on 2 mosques, even in the last few weeks. We're seeing the arrest of Ahmadis on a greater scale than we've seen previously. And unfortunately, ultimately, we've seen killings of some Ahmadis. We're seeing the Ahmadis. Actually, it's only a glimpse of what the Ahmadis are facing. I think the real situation is much worse. What the Ahmadis are experiencing is actually hard to narrate in words. And that's why this meeting is so important, as we will see videos and films to bring this to life. I think it's the duty of the international community to assist in ending the persecution of Ahmadi Muslims. And that's why it's so good that we've got these experts from the UN to help us. And therefore, I want to turn now, if I can, to Dr. Ahmed Shahid, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief. Dr. Shahid has been in post since 2016. He's also the Deputy Director of the Essex Human Rights Centre, and previously he's held the post of Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in Iran. He's extremely experienced. He has a background as a politician from the Maldives. He was previously Minister of Foreign Affairs as a member of the Maldives Democratic Party, and he was celebrated as a leading human rights defender in the Maldives by Amnesty International. At the 46th session of the UN Human Rights Council in March 2021, Dr. Shahid presented a report which concluded that anti-Muslim hatred has risen to epidemic proportions. So it's a real privilege for me to introduce Dr. Ahmed Shahid.
Thank you, Sir Edward. Good morning and good afternoon. I'm delighted to join my special procedures colleagues and other speakers and friends at this important side event. Today's event offers us the opportunity to reflect on the human rights situation and the lived experiences of Ahmadi Muslims around the world, as described in detail in the recent report by the International Human Rights Committee based in the UK. The report showcases the multifaceted and systematic violations perpetrated against Ahmadis based on socially entrenched prejudices and stigma, as well as on a perceived and politically instrumentalized doctrinal disagreement around Islam. The report sheds light on the structural discrimination suffered by Ahmadi Muslims in all areas, including civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights. It's a particular concern that in certain countries and societies, Ahmadis are forced to deny their religious and cultural identity and beliefs in order to access to basic services and to participate in the cultural, economic, political, and social life. Throughout the years, my mandate has received numerous concerning reports and information about human rights violations perpetrated against Ahmadis, of course, as you heard from Pakistan, but also in Algeria, Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, Iran, and Sri Lanka, and has responded by undertaking advocacy initiatives, including through letters to the concerned governments, with the purpose of raising concern and inviting state authorities to provide information on remedial steps, as well as on broader institutional, legislative, and policy initiatives to ensure protection and promotion of the rights of persons belonging to the Ahmadi communities. More specifically, and since 2005, the mandate that I hold has raised concern and reported jointly with other mandate holders on issues, the following issues, for example, physical attacks and coordinated violent campaigns against Ahmadi Muslims and migrant communities, attacks and administrative closure of Ahmadi Muslim places of worship, arbitrary arrest and detention of Ahmadi Muslim human rights defenders and journalists, discrimination against Ahmadi children in accessing education, including enrollment bans and expulsion from schools and higher educational institutions, extrajudicial killings and forced internal displacement, administrative obstacles to registration of Ahmadi Muslim organizations and associations, application of constitutional and other legal provisions and decrees, including anti-blasphemy laws, to discriminate against the Ahmadi Muslim communities and to criminalizing the right to freedom of religion or belief, and of course, freedom of expression as well. A lack of accountability and failure by state authorities to prevent, prohibit, and investigate human rights violations of Ahmadi Muslims. As already mentioned in my latest report to the Human Rights Council in March this year, I noted patterns of sectarian and intra-Muslim prejudice and violence as part of my analysis of the broader phenomenon of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred. The Ahmadiyya Muslim experience in a number of countries is a characteristic example of how doctrinal and sectarian differences within the same religious organization or communities could provoke insurmountable tension, stigmatize a whole community, and lead to discrimination and violence against its members. Such situations are not permissible under international human rights law. Equality and non-discrimination on any ground, including religion or belief, the full enjoyment of all human rights and protection against any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred are fundamental elements for the development and promotion of a just, peaceful, and inclusive society. In this regard, states, as a primary duty bearer, are expected to undertake all appropriate legislative, institutional, and policy measures to create enabling environments for all to enjoy their rights and freedoms without discrimination, and to foster a climate of tolerance. Such initiatives would involve the repeal and discontinuation of discriminatory and exclusionary laws, policies, and practices, the strengthening of the national institutional framework on human rights, including with the establishment of independent mechanisms of human rights monitoring, reporting, and oversight, the strengthening of and effective support to accountability mechanisms, and the design and implementation of rights education programs, including literacy on freedom of religion or belief, targeting all relevant state institutions and public officials. Of special importance is the involvement of these processes, of the affected communities in these processes, and of the political and religious leaders and of faith organizations who, according to the Rabat Plan of Action, have a critical role to play in the fight against hatred or bigotry on religious grounds. I also wanted to respectfully remind states of the recommendations that they have made for themselves under the Human Rights Council 1618 resolution, which marks its 10th anniversary this year, and the provisions of the UN Declaration, the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on belief, which was adopted 40 years ago. Finally, I also want to underscore my recommendations to states and to the UN to include indicators linked to FORB, which is freedom, in the implementation and evaluation of the UN's development goals, to ensure that leaving no one behind also means not leaving religious minorities behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shahid. I think that was a very powerful recommendation at the end, that the UN's development goals should include ensuring that no one is left behind through persecution and hatred. I think that's very powerful. Thank you very much for that presentation. It's now my huge pleasure to ask Dr. Fernand de Vrenes, the UN Special Rapporteur on Minority Rights, to address you. He was appointed the Special Rapporteur in 2017. He's one of the world's leading experts on minority issues. Fernand also holds the post of Extraordinary Professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. Relevant to today's discussion, in July 2018, together with Dr. Shahid, he issued a joint statement on the persecution of Ahmadis in Pakistan, urging the Pakistani government to end discrimination, including in electoral law. So extremely well qualified to address us today. So can I invite Fernand to talk to us?
Thank you, Sir Edward. Excellences, distingués collègues, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, bonjour, assalamu alaikum. Please allow me first to express my appreciation at addressing this side event on the persecution of Ahmadi Muslims worldwide, organized by the International Human Rights Committee and the Coordination des Associations et des Particuliers pour la Liberté de Conscience. We've already heard that the Ahmadi community face in too many parts of the world what can only be described as oppression and even persecution for their beliefs. It's neither helpful nor necessary for me to repeat these, as this has already been very much more eloquently presented than I would have been able to do. There are perhaps two additional points which I, however, would like to bring to this discussion. First, the dangers connected to the denial that Ahmadis exist as a minority. And secondly, why Ahmadis should not hesitate to invoke the protection as a minority of religion or belief in international human rights law, because it's not only about individual human rights, but we are also looking at the protection of Ahmadis as a community. Now, on the first point, it's unfortunate that a number of governments around the world seek to deny the protection of individuals and communities that have a different religion or beliefs by actually denying that they exist. In other words, at times you have governments who will claim that a minority does not exist, and therefore they cannot have rights, which we at the United Nations recognize as part of international law. There is a United Nations declaration, for example, on the protection of the rights of national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, as well as a few specific treaty provisions, such as Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in addition to, general human rights provisions, which can be of significance for religious or belief minorities, such as, obviously, we just mentioned freedom of religion, but there's also one of the pillars of international law, which is the prohibition of discrimination on the ground of religion or belief, which can be particularly relevant. Now, this, as many of you will know, is what has apparently occurred in Pakistan last year, when the country's cabinet established the National Commission for Minorities and adopted the official position of the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Interfaith Harmony, that Ahmadis would be excluded from the Commission's membership and protection because, quote, and here I quote, they did not fall in the definition of minorities. You may also know that myself and my colleague just preceded me, Ahmed Shahid, that we raise our concerns of possible violations of the human rights of Ahmadis to the government of Pakistan in relation to this matter in an official communication last year. So let me be absolutely clear. A government cannot simply decide a minority does not exist because of its own definition or view as to who is or is not a member of a religious or belief minority. And as I indicated without any ambiguity last October in my annual report to the United Nations General Assembly on the significance of the four categories of minorities in international human rights law, and here I'm quoting from my own report to the General Assembly, quote, religious or belief minorities such as Ahmadis, however they are described or recognized in the state, are entitled to the full protection of their human rights and international law, including as persons who belong to a religious or belief minority and against acts of violence or persecution, end of quote. Secondly, Why is it important that Ahmadis not hesitate in claiming their human rights as a religious or belief minority? Now, time is short, so I'll focus on the fact that in addition to the equal protection of all of your human rights as individuals, which is usual in international law, raising issues of human rights as a religious or belief minority also allows, from a legal point of view, the consideration of protecting the interests of Ahmadis as a community. And this is important and perhaps not always well understood or appreciated dimension of the human rights of minorities. The reason is that almost all other human rights at the global level are mainly, we could say exclusively, fixated on individual rights. For national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities, however, there is one of the very rare instances where the community, which is a minority, can form what is also considered a community, as I said, under article provisions like Article 27 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states, and here I'm paraphrasing, that persons belonging to a religious or belief minority shall not be denied the right, in community with other members of their group, to profess and practice their own religion or beliefs as members of such a community. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a powerful reason why it's not for states to determine who is a minority. But as I indicated in another one of my reports to the UN General Assembly, that a minority is a factual, objective determination, which depends on whether individuals with a different religion or sets of belief are less than half the population of an entire country, whether or not they are citizens, and that this does absolutely not depend on any form of official recognition or status, or as to their economic, social, or political position in their country. I will end by saying that the persecution, demonizing, and even atrocities targeting of one community because of their beliefs or religion is one too many. And minorities in particular need the protection of their human rights without discrimination and equal respect of their identity. And I want to join my voice to that of my colleague who just preceded me to say that we also have to work with various United Nations, international and regional organizations to address this particular vulnerability and marginalization of the Ahmadis and other minorities. And that, amongst others, we have to look at the indicators that the United Nations has developed under these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and expand them to make sure that no one is left behind, particularly Ahmadis and other minorities. Merci, shukran, shukriya.
Thank you very much, Fernand. That was really powerful on how we need to recognize the rights of communities, and linking it to what your colleague Dr. Shahid said at the end was also powerful. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Irene Khan. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of freedom of opinion and expression. She was appointed as Special Rapporteur in August 2020. Previously, she'd been the Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2001 to 2009, followed by that as Director General of the International Development Law Organization. So she's incredibly well qualified to speak to us on this subject. Irene, over to you.
Thank you very much, Edward. Ahmadi Muslims are not just one of the most vulnerable and persecuted religious minorities, they're also a minority that does not get a lot of attention. And that is why I think this particular meeting is so significant. As special rapporteurs, we have been receiving complaints from this minority for something like 15 years. But of course, their persecution has much, much longer roots. And I do want to emphasize that in recent years, there's been a resurgence of attacks on Ahmadi Muslims, and it is part of a larger trend that we see of fundamentalism and authoritarianism coming together to create an oppressive environment for many religious, ethnic, and other minorities. But while this pressure on the Ahmadi Muslims is part of a larger, I would say, a larger geopolitical trend that we see, there are some very specific issues that we need to keep in mind. And I will come to issues directly relevant to my mandate. But let me say that what is so striking here is the way in which states have actually joined hands with what I would call fundamentalist religious groups to use the machinery, the full power of the state to oppress a community. So here we have state actors as well as non-state actors, but the obligation, the human rights obligation is on the state to respect human rights, but also to protect others from being attacked by non-state actors. So whether it is fundamentalist groups or whether it is state persecution, I think in this particular case, the obligation on the states is very strong. I would also like to highlight the way in which not just the right to religion, freedom of religion and belief, but a whole range of human rights are being affected, including economic, social, and cultural rights, where Ahmadi Muslims are being banned in certain countries from taking any public service employment. And I also want to highlight the situation of women, particularly when I look at my Zoom screen and I see that I'm the only woman on that screen. I think it is a reminder that even within communities, there are individuals or groups who may be particularly vulnerable. And I would like to highlight the situation of Ahmadi Muslim women because they are doubly persecuted as women, subject to gender discrimination that women suffer in many parts of the world, but alongside that, also as Ahmadi Muslims. And of course, children and their education, which Ahmed mentioned earlier. But let me come now to my mandate, freedom of expression, opinion and expression. I have just presented to the Human Rights Council a report on disinformation in the digital age. And in that context, actually, I did receive communications from members of the Ahmadi community who pointed out the disinformation campaigns to which they are being subjected on social media. And in particular, one piece of information was the situation in Pakistan, where the government, that is the state entity, the state institution, was actively working to have material removed from social media platforms that related to Ahmadi freedom of expression. Posts that were put up by Ahmadi groups were being asked to be removed. At the same time, there were troll farms that were actually trolling and attacking Ahmadi groups on the Ahmadi community on social media. So I think that has brought another dimension to the persecution that this community has suffered in the digital age, and that engages the responsibility of social media companies, the platforms themselves. They too have a responsibility here as gatekeepers of information, that they should first protect the freedom of expression of Ahmadi Muslims, but secondly, they should not allow that freedom to be abused by others to attack them. Under international law, freedom of expression is not an absolute right. It can be restricted, but there are some very, very clear circumstances or conditions or criteria under which it can be restricted. And those restrictions have to be applied have to be construed in a narrow sense, so that they do not actually destroy freedom of expression. So I would want to underline the point that while, of course, I fully agree with the statements from Ahmed and from Fernand that there are, what we're talking about here is issues that impact on freedom of religion. And what we're talking about is also the right of a community. But we're also talking about the right of individuals to say what they wish to say. Freedom of expression is a very broad, inclusive right that allows all kinds of information, ideas, and thoughts to be shared, including ideas and thoughts that might offend some others. And that is usually used as an excuse. When I have raised this issue with governments, I have been told that we are bound, that governments are bound to restrict certain ideas because it may be offensive to others in their community. And my point there is that freedom of expression is broad enough to allow us to say what is shocking, what is offensive. We do that all the time in the secular field, and it should also be allowed in the religious field. I think that is freedom of thought. That is freedom of opinion. And both freedom of thought and opinion come into the public domain through freedom of expression. That is one aspect of it. The other aspect, of course, is that freedom of expression can be prohibited. Where freedom of expression stops is when it becomes advocacy of hatred to incite violence, hostility, and discrimination on grounds of race, religion, or nationality. And that is where I think freedom of expression needs to stop. And that is where the protection of minorities and protection of religious minorities come into effect. So there are two sides to it that I think we need to keep very strongly in mind. As particularly in the modern age, where social media, digital technology has allowed us to, of course, to reach out much further than in the past and to be able to communicate, but it has also become a very dangerous weapon. What happens in the virtual world can sometimes translate into the real world, into violence. And we have seen that across the board in many, many countries. And I think here, this is extremely dangerous, what is happening, where governments are transferring their persecution of this minority into the virtual world and making it extremely dangerous, I would say. So, and I would engage, therefore I would want to repeat again that there is a responsibility on the side of states, both in terms of their own behavior, as well as in terms of non-state actors in their countries, but also a responsibility on the social media platforms. So my report on disinformation is available. It mentions the impact on religious and other minorities. It talks about the responsibility of social media, because very often they actually feed disinformation because of their business model of attracting people to the platforms. And they also engage, of course, they therefore engage liability, I believe. And I hope that this kind of event will allow us all to think very carefully of what freedom of expression really means and how we can actually promote tolerance on all sides. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Irene, for that fascinating insight. And I think the fact that you are focusing on the digital world and the social media and the need to think about freedom of expression in that medium is really, really important. We've seen that with some of the latest persecution of Ahmadis globally. So thank you very much for that. Now we move, friends, to some testimonies with some pre-recorded videos. Due to the recent escalation in the persecution of Ahmadis, the faces of the victims are not always shown for security reasons. I hope you understand that. But I want to pass over to my colleagues who are going to ensure that we see some testimonies from these videos. Thank you.
But in the case of Ahmadis, this promise remains completely unfulfilled. Religious discrimination against Ahmadis in Pakistan is highly deep-rooted in education. Prejudice is evident in a number of areas. From very early childhood, the Ahmadi students face discrimination and persecution. Curriculum and textbooks contain derogatory language towards Ahmadis, portraying them as inferiors and worthy of being killed. The Ahmadi students are often denied admissions at schools, colleges, and universities because of their faith, and they are constantly ridiculed, bullied, and boycotted, not only by the teachers, but also by their fellow students. They are beaten up, expelled from the educational institutions, and in some cases, they also receive death threats and murder threats. As a result of religious discrimination and persecution which the Ahmadi students face, most students develop mental disorders. There have been numerous cases of emotional disorders, anger, sadness, avoidance, trauma, depression, stress, and anxiety, which has been seen in these students. The textbook often use derogatory terms such as Mirzai, Qadianis, and non-Muslims and Kafirs for the Ahmadis. The doctrine of Khatm Nubuwwat, finality of prophethood, are to be taught to students as young as grade 1. The students have to declare their religions on the admission forms. Currently, 2 of our schools have been sealed by the government authorities without providing any evidence, and the cases of blasphemy have been registered against the management of these schools. 2 of our people are currently also in jail.
There is no security for Ahmadis in Pakistan on account of anti-Ahmadi laws. Other minorities are also not safe, but our persecution is legitimized by law. We cannot seek protection of law as the law itself authorizes tyranny against us. We have no security even to earn a living. Numerous Ahmadis have been killed for their faith. Ahmadis have no freedom of faith. A number of our mosques have been demolished and no action has been taken against the goons. I was exposed to all this. I had a job in Faisalabad. My senior, an engineer, was also an Ahmadi. When they came to know that we were Ahmadis, they sent for us, held an inquiry, and fired us. Thereafter, I faced the same problem at another job. Thus, fed up and seeing that there was no future for our next generation, no religious freedom, no security, I decided to flee. I sold my house and headed for journey. It was a dreadful journey involving 8 border crossings. I also had to walk long distances at times to arrive in Germany. Here I remained for 5 years. At the last occasion when I presented for the visa, the police arrested me. I was kept incarcerated for 2 months and was then deported to Pakistan. On arrival in Pakistan, at the airport, I was deprived of all my savings in my pocket during the investigation. Here, I am again exposed to the most unpleasant social existence.
I was a student at Punjab Medical College, Faisalabad, and was in second year MBBS when a movement was started against Ahmadi students, and there were total 23 students, and we had to face a very hostile environment created by the students and different religious movements inside the college, and even the teachers and the lecturers. They used to place posters and banners that stated some abusive language against us, and students used to hoot when we used to pass in hostel corridors and college classes, and when we used to enter the class or the lecture halls, they used to isolate us and try to avoid. Even at the hostel mess, people started avoiding us, and they used to say kafir when we passed in the corridors of the hostel and when we were passing for our rooms. Even our friends and roommates were threatened. The hostility and aggression and this bad behavior of students and even the teachers resulted in a hateful environment. And the principal of that time, instead of taking care of our rights, rusticated all the MD students. This has never occurred before. This affected our studies and resulted in loss of our time and education. And the mental stress we faced due to this was another problem. This matter was taken to higher officials. I was transferred to Allama Iqbal Medical College, Lahore, and where all these things didn't stop. I had to face more difficulties there because people there thought that we have done something bad.
घर जलने की वजह से मेरी दो बेटियां हीरा तबस्सुम और कायनात तबस्सुम और मेरी वालदा बुशरा बेगम, ये मौके पर वो आग का जो धुआं था ना, उसकी वजह से उनके दम घुटने से फौत हो गई, शहीद हो गई। मेरी जो बेटी बड़ी थी वो तकरीबन 6.5 साल की थी और छोटी बेटी कायनात तबस्सुम जो थी वो 7 माह की थी।
My name is Udin, the regional Amir of Ahmadiyya in West Nusa Tenggara Province, who handle the cases of attack, damage, and expulsions of Ahmadiyya in this province. The attack toward Ahmadis in Lombok and Sumbawa have happened massively and structuredly several times in some places. For example, in Kruat, East Lombok, in 2018, 8 houses were destroyed and attacked in Pemongkong Sub-District, East Lombok. Then, in Sambi Alen Bayan, West Lombok, the attack of non-Ahmadis towards 9 houses and 1 mosque that has just been built by Ahmadis was damaged. This attack caused 1 Ahmadi pass away and 1 seriously injured. Family groups of about 600 persons were attacked and evacuated to Mataram, Java, Sumbawa, and Sulawesi.
जॉब से वापस आ रहे थे उन्होंने 500 ringgit वो सैलरी एडवांस ली थी, वो स्नैच कर ली, खींच ली, और उसके अलावा उन्होंने मोबाइल भी खींच लिया और उन्होंने ये थ्रेट भी किया, दोबारा 3rd टाइम थ्रेट किया कि अगर आप दोबारा मुझे इस रास्ते पे जाते हुए नज़र आए तो हम दोबारा नहीं बख्शेंगे। हम पाकिस्तान से अपनी जानें बचा के यहाँ आए हैं तो हमारी जब यहीं पे ही यही हालत होगी, अब हम यहाँ से हम कहाँ जाएंगे, हमारी लाइफ सेफ हो जाए।
I think we can all agree those were very powerful testimonies. And we're now going to move live to another testimony, this time not pre-recorded, but a live one, to Ahmad Farouk, who, having been shot in the head, fortunately survived and came to the UK and claimed asylum. Ahmad.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everyone. So I belong to Karachi, Pakistan. I was studying, I was completing my MBA in UK. I was in UK for my studies. I went back home to Pakistan for my brother's wedding. And after the Friday prayers in Karachi, we were attacked by the extremists. And the sole reason was us being Ahmadis. So I got shot in the head. My father got shot 6 bullets. And my brother, who just got married 2 days ago, died, at that spot. So he died 2 days after his wedding. Then I was flown back to UK, to Queen Elizabeth Hospital, where the bullet was removed. Miraculously, the bullet was between my 2 eyes. and I survived. The operation took place at the same place where Malala was being operated at the same time as well. And my father luckily survived as well. The bullets were removed. He still has 2 bullets in him. I went through PTSD. My whole family was ruined because of this. My mother still can't sleep peacefully because of the events. And I just think that myself, I'm just one example of thousands of events happening on a weekly basis. Every week you hear this happening. And every time you know that there are thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who are in fear of being attacked. And while we speak here, I know there might be some news coming later on today or later in the week of a similar event happening. That just doesn't ruin that person's life, but it ruins families and families. And then the depression and everything that the people deal with later on is enormous. And at workplace, for students, you constantly live in this fear that if you go out, you can be targeted, and just purely because of your faith, and you don't know if you're going to return back home or not. If you've got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you. Sorry, you're on mute. I think we can't hear you.
I do apologize. Thank you, Ahmad, for that testimony. Thank you for your courage. I think we're all moved by what's happened to you and your family. And I hope here in the UK, with the support of the Ahmadi community and hopefully the rest of the country, you can move forward. We will have questions later. I'd like to move, though, now on to an intervention from Dr. Katrina Lantos. Dr. Katrina Lantos-Svet is president of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. It was established in 2008 to continue the legacy of her father, the late Congressman Tom Lantos. Dr. Lantos has a very prestigious record campaigning on human rights. She's the former chair and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she teaches human rights and American foreign policy at Tufts University. So Katrina, it's lovely to welcome you. Thank you for addressing us today.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor, but a very sobering honor, to be with such a distinguished group of individuals. And I know everyone has been moved, as I have, by particularly these powerful testimonies. And you know, I'm in the midst of real experts, and so I don't want to take too much of your time, but I want to say that here in the United States, we have been hearing a lot about issues that we need to confront on our home front, and a lot of discussion about what systemic racism looks like and how we can do a better job as a nation in confronting it. But in looking at the circumstances of the Ahmadi community in Pakistan, we see a textbook case of what true systemic discrimination, persecution looks like. It is not subtle, it's not hidden, it's not something that is somehow embedded in people's mindsets, but not manifested in law. But in Pakistan, we see the intentional, inescapable systemic oppression of an entire community. And what is adds to the outrage and the tragedy of it is just what an extraordinary community the Ahmadi community is. Their contribution to Pakistani society, I mean, you all know better than I do that some of the most distinguished individuals in Pakistani history have been members of the Ahmadiyya community. The only Nobel Prize winner, the individual who sort of founded the Pakistani judicial system. I mean, I could go on. And of course, those of us who are privileged to know members of the community in the United States and elsewhere, we see the way in which they enrich and strengthen every community that they're part of. And I do want to pay tribute to His Holiness, because I think his teachings and his influence and the remarkable way in which he guides his community to deal with these terrible persecutions and injustices and targeting and murders and destruction of life and limb and property with such dignity and such forbearance and forgiveness. It is truly incredible and overwhelming, and I think certainly a lesson to me, and I'm sure to many others as well. But I think what I would like to add to this discussion, because as I say, I know I'm in the midst of many experts and I defer to their expertise, but what we need more of, and I kind of come from the political arena. My father was a congressman. He was the founder of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and he was in every human rights fight with all his heart, because he himself was a survivor of the Holocaust. So he understood better than most what it means when no one stands with you, and what it means when people do stand with you, and when they advocate for you, and when they fight on your behalf. My husband was also a member of Congress. I ran for Congress at one time, so I sort of come from that world of politics. And we need really to find more champions in more democracies, including my own, who are ready to use the leverage and use the political power that they have to hold the Pakistani government accountable for what are absolute violations of international law. The distinguished rapporteur spoke to this earlier, but Pakistan is engaged in wholesale violations of their international legal obligations in their targeting and abuse and persecution of the Ahmadi community. They have to be held to account for this. And what we must not do, and this is always, I think, the danger that those of us who operate in the human rights space face, we must not sort of sideline and put in a box on the side these grave human rights concerns and these grave abuses that are taking place because we have other things on the agenda with countries. That's always the temptation. Well, we have these security items on our agenda, or we have this on the agenda, and so we're sort of going to sideline and downplay our concerns. Certainly a country like the United States has to recognize that we still loom large, we still wield a lot of influence, and we have so many levers of influence and power that we can use to demand changes in policy. And again, as I say, to hold Pakistan to its own international legal obligations. So I guess the perspective that I would like to add to this is that we have to find, as many champions and allies and advocates within the corridors of power to really put pressure on all of our countries' governments and administrations. Here in the United States, on the Biden administration, I know President Biden. Actually, my very first job as a young lawyer was working for him on the Senate Judiciary Committee way back in the day. And so I know he really does have a very sincere heart, if you will, for human rights. These things matter to him. I think that our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, his stepfather was a Holocaust survivor, a very distinguished individual. So, we have people within the new Biden administration who feel deeply about these issues, but it is still easy for advocacy and for strength in advocacy to get downgraded and sort of put lower down on the totem pole. And so that would sort of be my plea. It's certainly something that we try to do at the Lantos Foundation. I want to just mention, because this was brought to my attention for the first time earlier this morning, actually by Nassim, my friend Nassim, that apparently Germany is repatriating or extraditing Ahmadi individuals who are seeking asylum in Germany. And to me, that's just outrageous. That's just outrageous. Any person, a member of the Ahmadi community who manages to escape from the kinds of circumstances that we just heard testified to and seeks asylum, these people should not be being repatriated. All of us in this group know what the rules are governing international asylum claims. Well, there can be no doubt that people in the Ahmadi community fall into one of those categories, that they are facing persecution because of one of those legal categories that international law provides for. And so, you know, we need to be asking assertively and pointedly, why is any member of the Ahmadi community being involuntarily repatriated or extradited back to Pakistan? That just should not be happening. So, you know, there are a number of specific agenda items I think we need to focus on and zero in on. And then there's that broader mission we have of making sure that governments, and many of us live in societies where we do have governments that subscribe to the rule of law, that value human rights, but we need to be fighting harder to make sure that they are not sidelining these causes. And then I guess the other thing I would say is that we still have work to do to tell the story of who the Ahmadi people are, of what this community is. I think it's not well known, and it's not therefore as much of a cause with as broad of a swath of the human rights community as it should be. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with such a distinguished gathering. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That was such a powerful intervention. Thank you very much for that. And I think you, at the end, reminded us that the UN Convention, the 51 Refugee Convention, which of course was born out of the Second World War and the Holocaust, is something that the whole UN and all members of the UN should remember and should apply in circumstances that we see the Ahmadi Muslims facing in Pakistan. And I hope whether it's the German government, the British government, or others, they abide by their obligations as signatories to the UN Convention from 1951, and that we do far more. That not only will help the individuals involved, but will send a powerful message to the government of Pakistan that the world is watching them and will not tolerate. And I think the idea of sending Ahmadi Muslims back to Pakistan is just not acceptable. So thank you for that very powerful intervention. My friend and colleague Siobhan McDonough unfortunately has had to go to a constituency event. She's an amazing champion of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. She's the chair of the all-party parliamentary group that I mentioned at the beginning. But I understand as a fellow MP that she's had to go back to talk to some of her constituents. So it's my pleasure now to introduce to you the journalist and Amnesty International campaigner, Rabia Mahmood, who has over 10 years experience reporting from Pakistan. Rabia has conducted extensive research on tracking persecution of religious minorities and the extremist militant organizations that target them. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be able to welcome Rabia to give her insights into this issue. Rabia. Now, I just noticed I don't see Rabia with us. Can I just check with colleagues organizing this event?
She is on, Ed. She's in the audience. Thierry, you'll have to unmute her, I think. Hopefully she can.
Perfect. I think she's coming on now. Rabia, great to see you. Well, we will shortly, I hope.
Hi, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Hi. Thank you for having me. I would just like to correct my introduction a bit. It was really kind of you. I'm a former researcher with Amnesty International. I was based out of Sri Lanka. But currently I'm working independently as a researcher and a journalist. Basically, a lot of stuff has been said, which of course I would be adding to and repeating and emphasizing. Thanks so much for doing this event. It's extremely important knowing how much at risk increasingly Ahmadis and other religious minorities in Pakistan are. I would just jump right in. During the current government of the Prime Minister Imran Khan, the marginalization of Pakistani Ahmadis has intensified on multiple fronts, and actually multiple fronts have been opened against them, from the floor of the parliament to offline gatherings to cases on fabricated charges under the anti-Ahmadi and blasphemy laws, and also the draconian legislations which address the online spaces, to everyday profiling of the community, to the social media platforms. And we also have multiple Ahmadis who are on death row for blasphemy in Pakistan. Due to the continuous threats and dangerous hate campaigns and violent attacks, some of which resulted in the death of the community members over the last 1 year even, a number of Ahmadi families have been forced to flee their hometowns in search of temporary protection elsewhere in the country. And due to the current travel restrictions and lockdowns, the Ahmadis and other religious minorities of Pakistan remain at an even higher risk. But because the targeted attacks, violent attacks, are specifically against the Ahmadis compared to other religious minorities, I'm not saying that other religious minorities are not at risk in Pakistan, or that they are not suffering, or that they are not slapped with blasphemy charges. They are, but Ahmadis are targeted. We can look at the number of extrajudicial targeted killings of Ahmadis in the last 1 year and assess that yes, they are at a different sort of a risk. And things also look increasingly bleak as the Pakistani Prime Minister's special aide on religious and interfaith harmony is an anti-Ahmadi campaigner and has long used his platform and influence to advocate against Ahmadis in an already hostile country. And I must say, as Dr. Fernan mentioned, that Ahmadis were excluded from becoming the part of Pakistani National Commission of Minorities. And we owe that exclusion completely to this gentleman who is the current honorary aide to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on interfaith harmony. It is so ironic. So you can imagine the kind of political atmosphere and the kind of enabling and permission which is given to Ahmadi hatred and incitement of hatred and Ahmadi violence and bigotry against the community in the country. As Dr. Lantos said, it's very much a systemic oppression. It is very institutionalized, as we know. I would also like to highlight this, use this opportunity to also add my voice to what Dr. Irene Khan said on the responsibility of the social media platform, because I happen to be one of the researchers who for the past 4 years has repeatedly gathered data from the social media platforms and reported it to specific desks in, for instance, like in Facebook and Twitter. And this data is basically about is about harmful and dangerous speech and content on social media. And these are not just hashtags, but also multimedia content, which is being used in a very coordinated and a very thoughtful procedural way by the religious extremist sectarian organizations and parties like Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which is it's a sectarian religious party, which was allowed to register as a political party in 2017, and then its members are sitting in the parliament or in provincial and national assembly. What they've used, and what happens is that when we report these trends to the social media companies, it is like there is a lot of uncertainty. There's a possibility that those trends would never be removed. And I was just looking at my email today, and there I came across these emails of reporting multiple trends against Ahmadis, extremely dangerous conversation, which incites murder of Ahmadis, right? It's not just inciting hatred, it incites murder, violence against Ahmadis. And those trends were reported last year in June and July, and they are still online. They're still being used by people, not just people who are from these sectarian organizations, but generally people who identify as members and supporters of the ruling political party and ruling opposition party. So a lot of even like mainstream political activists are basically using this narrative to come across as basically very sincere to the country and Islam. So this is a big issue that social media platforms, who, as we know, they removed thousands of posts of QAnon content in the US, which was deemed dangerous, and they actually use their policies in accordance to their policy. They remove their content. But if we are reporting this content from Pakistan, which puts minorities like Ahmadis at risk, that content is not removed. And I think that should be part of the agenda, that we need to speak to these social media, do advocacy with these social media platforms and these companies, because they have a responsibility, and they are enabling massive human rights violations in our country, and they need to pay attention to that, because it's also a violation of their own policies. One more thing, I was in Sri Lanka for a couple of years, and also there when Ahmadis were part of the Muslim communities which were displaced due to attacks by after the Easter bombing in Sri Lanka, which kind of targeted the refugees and asylum seekers, and Ahmadis were like the biggest group of asylum seekers and refugees at that time. And then I also met Ahmadis who are stuck in the due to the bureaucratic issues. They are stuck for years in Malaysia, waiting to either be recognized as refugees or waiting to be resettled in other countries. And these people are barely getting by because they have no financial support. And women make up a lot of, make a significant part of these groups, and they are vulnerable because they are separated from their families. And in fact, I met women, young women and older women and young girls who had faced gender-based harassment because of their Ahmadi identity in Pakistan. And they were sent by their families to these countries. And they were stuck in the system at the risk of being separated further by their families, and also at the mercy of the system because they had no jobs and they could barely get by. They barely had food, money to eat one meal a day. And this is about Ahmadi women and other families who are stuck in parts of Malaysia and parts of Thailand and parts of Sri Lanka.
Rabia.
About what I researched. And I just want to say that these are some of the things that we need to address, not just like persecution of Ahmadis in Pakistan, but also the continuation of that persecution and their suffering that they face in countries outside Pakistan as well.
Thank you, Rabia. Thank you. That's a very powerful intervention. Excuse me if I just move on, because I'm conscious that our next contributor may have to leave, and he's been waiting very patiently, but thank you, Rabia. Can I now introduce to colleagues Dr. Amjad Mahmood Khan. Dr. Khan is a lecturer in law at the University of California. He's a recognized international expert on religious freedom in the Islamic world, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and Pacific Council on International Policy. Dr. Khan, it's a privilege. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. There's been very moving testimony provided in this session, and I'm privileged to be a part of it. I want to be succinct and try to provide some points that have not yet been covered. I've been listening intently to all of the testimony. I want to latch on to something that Special Rapporteur Irene Khan mentioned, which I think is very important. That Pakistan's persecution of Ahmadi Muslims has, recently taken a high-tech turn. In mid-December of 2020, trolls in Pakistan, as she mentioned, launched a coordinated hate and disinformation campaign against the community on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, which has resulted in an uptick of hate crimes and murders of members of this already vulnerable group. And this coordinated hate campaign is, it's actually very curious, the timing of it. And I wanted to provide a few additional pieces to the puzzle of what is, I think, an incredibly disturbing trend. So just 1 month before that troll campaign, on November 30th, 2020, the Pakistan government enacted a new regulation, removal and blocking of unlawful online content rules 2020. It's the unlawful online content rules, which amends what in Pakistan is known as PICA, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act 2016, which broadened the Pakistan government's authority to initiate new legal actions against website operators inside and outside of Pakistan. And one particular aspect of the so-called the cyber laws that have been amended is a provision, and as a lawyer, I'm very focused on what extraterritorial application of law, a very disturbing provision. In fact, one of the most expansive and unusual provisions I've ever seen in 20 years of studying these issues. And that's Section 37 of the PICA, which gives the PTA, the Telecommunication Authority in Pakistan, unbridled powers to block or remove online content. So they target service providers and social media companies like Facebook, Google, Twitter, YouTube, and gives PTA the authority to remove or block information, quote, that it considers necessary in the interest of the glory of Islam or the integrity, security, or defense of Pakistan, public order, decency, or morality. But what's most disturbing about it is it applies to, quote, any act committed outside of Pakistan by any person if the act constitutes an offense under these laws and affects a person, property, IT system, or data located in Pakistan. This is Section 1, Paragraph 4. Now, this is very, very important because what we've observed is that anti-Ahmadi clerics with close ties to influential Pakistani officials are working in tandem with the Federal Investigation Agency in Pakistan, the FIA, a government agency tasked with enforcing these very cyber laws to target high-ranking community officials in Pakistan in a few ways. One in particular is by embroiling them in a web of frivolous cases. Now, this is now domestic application, and I'll talk a little bit about extraterritorial application. But in the domestic front, these cases are part of a well-organized plan to disrupt the functioning of the community by targeting senior Ahmadi leaders. But more pernicious in my mind, and something that hits close to home, is something that happened in the United States, which is on December 24th, 2020, there was a very unusual situation where the PTA issued a notice that was sent to the US citizen operators of the official US website of the Ahmadiyya Muslim Community. And that notice required both the US citizens to remove all content from the official website of the community within 24 hours of receipt or risk being prosecuted under Pakistan's blasphemy laws. I'm talking about US citizens now. The PTA threatened penalties under PICA, which included sanctions up to 500 million rupees or 3.1 million US dollars if the official website of the US community, which is trueislam.com, would not remove itself entirely. And so these two Ahmadi US citizens face the possibility of criminal prosecution currently today, and they've retained US legal counsel to challenge PTA's actions. This is an unprecedented governmental action and something totally new in the ongoing saga of the persecution of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. So I'll stop there by simply summarizing here at the end that we are seeing a disturbing trend and use of cyber laws by the PTA, 20 other Ahmadi websites outside of Pakistan, including in Australia, the UK, Canada, Germany, targeting those citizens who are Ahmadis, have nothing to do with Pakistan. They're being threatened with criminal prosecution. And this is something that I know Special Rapporteur Irene Khan is aware of, and I think the international community should take note of. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Professor Khan. That was extremely powerful contribution. And I think it shows with social media and the internet, the extra challenges that we face. And it's certainly something that the international community and I hope the UN can look at because it is extremely concerning that a country can conduct its persecution of people of faiths, even when those people are living in other countries. I mean, it's bad enough, and it is so serious that they are conducting such state-sponsored persecution in Pakistan. but to attempt to globalize that persecution should be a wake-up call to every person across the world who cares about human rights and religious freedom. And I think it brings the Pakistani government into serious questions. And I hope at the United Nations Human Rights Council and elsewhere, all countries will come together to reject this outrageous abuse. So thank you very much for that powerful testimony from a lawyer of your background. That really speaks volumes. Thank you. It's now my privilege to introduce Lisa Patterson. She is the acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labour. She's a US State Department senior official for civilian security, democracy and human rights. And she's been a US ambassador in her past. I think she's joining us by video. So I'll hand over to the team to screen that video. Thank you.
Good morning and good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be a part of today's important discussion. We deeply appreciate the work of the International Human Rights Committee to promote international religious freedom and to advocate for persecuted Ahmadi Muslims worldwide. I want to extend my gratitude to Sir Ed Davey for facilitating today's conversation and to Special Rapporteurs Shahid, De Varenne, and Khan for their steadfast work on human rights at the United Nations. The United States has long closely followed the plight of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community globally. As many of you are well aware, Ahmadis have been subjected to various forms of persecution on account of their religious identity and beliefs since their community's founding. Despite the hard work of activists such as yourselves, authorities continue to target Ahmadi Muslims for harassment, abuse, and discrimination in too many countries around the world. Two troubling examples I will mention today are Pakistan and Algeria. Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan face pervasive abuses at the hands of both government officials and others in society. Constitutional provisions force Ahmadis to choose between identifying as Ahmadi or Muslim, thereby preventing them from obtaining national ID cards, voting, or obtaining passports without renouncing their faith. Ahmadis who identify as Muslim can face up to 3 years imprisonment. Discriminatory laws and abuses by authorities signal to other societal actors, including violent extremists, that violence against members of minority communities is acceptable, fostering a climate of impunity. Officials regularly engage in anti-Ahmadi rhetoric and attend events that critics say incite violence. Authorities are slow to condemn attacks on members of religious minority groups and have failed to take sufficient steps to prevent future abuses. Each incident of discrimination or violence impacts a life and community that spans more than just one city or nation. In July 2020, an attacker gunned down Tahir Nasim Ahmed, a US citizen and self-identified Ahmadi Muslim, in a courtroom in Peshawar as he faced blasphemy charges. Since then, there have been a number of targeted attacks against Ahmadi Muslims and sectarian protests against Shias in Karachi and other vulnerable minority communities across the country. The government of Algeria refuses to permit Ahmadi Muslims to identify as Muslim. Because they lack official registration, the government considers Ahmadi worship services and other community activities illegal. Authorities have arrested more than 330 Ahmadis since 2017. After being charged with blasphemy, the leader of the local Ahmadi community was forced into exile in Morocco. As of May 2021, approximately 50 cases against Ahmadis are pending with the country's Supreme Court. In the face of such abuses, all of us in the international community have the responsibility to speak out and to demonstrate solidarity with all those oppressed on account of their beliefs. The U.S. State Department's International Religious Freedom Report, issued annually, documents these and similar abuses globally, and we use that report to inform our advocacy as we press governments to ensure full respect for the rights of their citizens. We are most effective when like-minded governments and communities speak with one voice, including through multilateral fora like the UN Human Rights Council. This is also why the U.S. and our partners work through shared platforms such as the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance to share information and coordinate our religious freedom advocacy. The United States is committed to using all available tools, both positive and punitive, to advance this universal right. The State Department has designated Pakistan as a country of particular concern for the past several years, due in part to its continued abuses against Ahmadi Muslims. For officials who commit abuses, we can also impose costs and consequences, including visa restrictions, sanctions designations, and export controls. We advocate for the rights of Ahmadis not only to secure justice for individuals, but because promoting human rights advances shared goals of security and prosperity for all the citizens of a country. Defending and promoting the freedom of religion or belief, as well as related freedoms of expression and assembly, promotes peace, stability, and economic prosperity for all members of a society, minorities and majority alike. Thank you for including us in this important event. Again, I'm honored and I appreciate all you do to promote international religious freedom. I look forward to our continued collaboration and work towards those goals.
Well, that's really a powerful contribution from the US State Department. We now move to questions to the panel. We're rather short on time, so if my panel members can keep their answers relatively short, we'll see if we can get through a number of questions that have been submitted, which I'll read out to members of the panel, and one or two from people watching this, and I'll ask them to ask in person. So can I ask Yasser Hamdani, barrister and human rights advocate based in Pakistan, to stand by, because I'm going to ask him to ask a question shortly. But the first question is to Irene Khan. It's a question from Dr. Aaron Rhodes, who's the president of the Forum for Religious Freedom. And he'd like to know, when Pakistani officials persecute Ahmadis and engage in incitement to violence against them, are you prepared to recommend targeted Magnitsky-type sanctions on these individuals? Dr. Khan.
Well, it's hard to answer in general terms what we would ask or not ask in terms of sanctions. Sanctions, as you know, go way beyond human rights issues and can have impact also if they're unilaterally applied on the general population. So they have to be used in a very targeted and careful way. And of course, in some countries like the United States, they have legislation on in which situations they're able to impose sanctions. But I think it is more important to focus on the particular situation and find out what's the best way of putting pressure on countries. There are many countries that have been sanctioned, Belarus, for example, or even Russia, on cases on which I'm working as Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Opinion and Expression, where things haven't improved solely through sanctions. So I think one needs to look to see what's going to work where. And a lot of pressure has to be put on Pakistan and also on other countries that have restrictions against Ahmadi Muslims.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask David Schmidtke, the spokesperson from the Refugee Council of Saxony, to stand by, but now go to Yasser Hamdani, barrister and human rights advocate in Pakistan. He's got a question for Dr. Ferdinand. I think we need to unmute Yasser, please. How are we doing? Ferdinand's waiting in anticipation.
Can move to
Can you give me your name, please, again?
It's Yasser Hamdani. Do you have him, Terry?
No, I didn't find it on the list of attendee.
Okay, well, let me move to the next question then. That's from David Schmidtke, who's a spokesperson for the Refugee Council of Saxony. And it's a question to Ahmed Shahid, Dr. Shahid. So you need to, is David, I think I've seen David Schmidtke in the audience.
David, no, I have no David.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that Yasser?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, is that Yasser?
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Yasser,
yes.
Please.
So my question essentially, my question is that as the Special Rapporteur spoke about a number of issues, in terms of minority, the problem with the Ahmadi community's unique persecution in Pakistan is that they have to deny their Muslim identity in order to get voting rights. Now, given this situation, given that this is a complete denial of the United Nations Human Rights Declaration, what is the Special Rapporteur, or for that matter, the entire panel, going to do in terms of getting the Pakistan government to kind of fulfill its, and there has been some talk about it, but that's what it is. It's something that is unheard of in terms of, Algeria, I just found out that Algeria had something similar. But as a country with a constitution and Article 20, which talks about religious freedom, how does the UN, or for that matter, the British government, which you, the British Parliament that you belong to, what do you plan to do about this persecution?
Thank you very much for that question. I think we have to perhaps I should clarify a point that I tried to make earlier. It is not because a government denies the existence of a group as a minority that is accepted in international human rights law. And what I mean by that is that there are other governments in different parts of the world that will deny that a particular community constitute a minority with any legal recognition or rights. It does happen. And the position that is very clearly made under my mandate, and I think at the United Nations, is that regardless of a group's legal status or official recognition, they can still constitute a minority in international human rights law, and that the full range of human rights and international law is still available to them. In other words, the position of Pakistan, of the Pakistan authorities, do not affect the rights that they can claim as a community, as a minority group, in terms of religion or belief. So even though it may be the view that with some officials in Pakistan that the Ahmadi are not Muslims, that does not impact in any way at all their rights that they can claim under international human rights law and as a minority. And I would suggest to you that if, because you referred directly to the issue of voting, I think, to the right to vote, that's a pretty fundamental right in terms of having equal access to the right to vote without discrimination for citizens. I would urge you that these matters be brought up and made as visible as possible in terms of in various other governments around the world, but also with the public, because someone mentioned it earlier, the Ahmadis are not necessarily well known in other parts of the world. And I think that's perhaps something that needs to be addressed much further and even more. So I would invite you to approach myself and my colleagues in areas which falls within our mandate to perhaps bring the plight of the Ahmadis give it more visibility, and also a greater presence with international mechanisms as much as possible. Because the more you talk about it, the more it can be addressed, the more you will raise awareness about these issues. And an awareness which doesn't always reach people in many other parts of the world, and also governments and politicians who might be actually sensitive and willing to help you in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernand. I've got a question now for all the UN Special Rapporteurs, and I'll bring you each in turn. I'll start with Ahmed, as he's been waiting patiently. The question is from Harry van Bommel, who's a Dutch politician who's worked on foreign policy. And Harry's question is this: what steps do you see as necessary to ensure countries that are persecuting Ahmadis change their behavior? I'll read it once more so everyone can hear it. What steps do you see as necessary to ensure countries that are persecuting Ahmadis change their behavior? Ahmed.
Right, thank you. I think, we should think in multiple steps terms. There won't be a single, way we can change behavior of states. So we need to think about some coercive measures. I think there's been some news coming out of Strasbourg or Brussels that there could be, at least MEPs are calling for a review of GSP plus status for Pakistan. I mean, that is an important pressure point to think about the commitments they have to fulfill under the GSP plus rules. Then we've heard about the Magnitsky type, sanctions on targeted ones or individuals who are perpetrators of these crimes. That's also something to consider. You have in the UN system various monitoring bodies and various forums to identify the problems. But beyond that, we must also engage in ways that can, empower those people within the country who might be agents of change. We must combine both coercive measures to put pressure on the most egregious violators. We must also at the same time build capacity for those agents who could do change from within to be able to do their part. But right now we are in Pakistan a very, very, I think, important time. And so I think the points by Dr. Catherine Lantos is very important. We have to think about really, putting significant pressure on Pakistan to change behavior. And there are ways we've done this. And of course, the biggest challenge is looking at competing interests of advocacy and advocating states, steward states, balancing concerns for security with human rights. I think there are examples like in the Helsinki process where you could do both. You could be pursuing broader national interests, but at the same time pressuring human rights advancement. I say this because I think there's a strategic change happening in the region with the Western withdrawal from Afghanistan. Things are going to happen here. It's really going to make things worse for the people of the region. So there is a need to really put up the coercive measures as well. Same time engagement that builds capacity of those who could be movers within the system. Now, I know in the UN system, there are a number of things happening. We have the Office for Genocide Prevention working in the country, educating people to support, equals for everybody. We have the various other rights mechanisms, naming and shaming and calling out what's going on wrong. What's missing is the UN doesn't have the teeth unless Security Council would act on this. But instead of that, there would be like I said, the EU Parliament or others, the EU Commission doing trading with Pakistan, as well as countries with Magnitsky type legislation who could put some pressure on these countries. I think multiple steps are required. The question is, what would be sufficient for this change to occur? Not just what is necessary, but what is sufficient to make sure there is a change in behavior of Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I ask Irene Khan if she has a response to that?
Well, I would agree with what Shahid says, that we have to, Shahid said that we have to use multifaceted strategies. We also have to keep in mind that there are a number of countries that are involved in this persecution. Pakistan is, of course, one of the worst. But we have also heard about neighboring countries, including my own country, Bangladesh, which does not have a great record on this issue either. And so one needs to actually, as allies, one needs to put pressure. So really, who will these countries listen to? And I think Europeans, the UK, the US have a very big role to play here. And we heard earlier from Ms. Lantos about the multiple agendas that countries have. Now, as part of their multiple agenda, they need to put human rights on it, because if they don't, they pay a very big price down the road on the other goals. So I think the allies, Brussels certainly, but also London, I mean, you have global Britain now, and Britain is trying to find a new role for itself post-Brexit. I think this is a great opportunity to show that human rights will be central to that foreign policy.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but could I invite Ferdinand, just in case he's got some final remarks on that last question, then we'll have to conclude.
The persecution of Ahmadis is a global phenomenon also. I don't think we can separate it from what's happening around the world, and particularly with social media. Social media is now the favorite tool of propaganda, but propaganda that actually creates an environment where hate, but also hate crimes can be normalized in a sense. Intolerance, bias, discrimination is normalized. And politicians respond to this and sometimes instrumentalizes this. Therefore, I think we need to have a global response, a global legal instrument to deal with social media and hate speech and hate crimes against, well, those that need most protection, particularly minorities, including Ahmadis. And this is the only way to make sure that social media platforms assume their responsibility and obligations, but also that governments are not given carte blanche. Because as we've heard previously, some governments actually use the situation of not knowing where exactly lies the line between freedom of expression and permissible restrictions go too far and actually sometimes persecute those that need actually protection. So we need a global response, and the UN should be in the leadership role to develop an instrument to ensure that we address the real causes of instability and persecution today, including of Ahmadis. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernand. That's a very powerful way to actually conclude this important event. I'm particularly grateful to all the UN Special Rapporteurs who've spoken to us today. There's an awful lot of people from around the world who've been listening. Thank you to all of you who've given up time to take part in this event. I should mention that there will be a joint statement from the rapporteurs on this issue. I think we've seen a number of great ideas coming from the rapporteurs and through this discussion. What I would say as a parliamentarian, as a politician in the UK, is I'm determined to work cross-party and internationally to support the Ahmadi Muslim community, not just in Pakistan, but in the far too many countries where they face persecution. And I think we do need to address the new ways that using new technology that are being deployed by the Pakistani government and others to persecute Ahmadis. And I think the UN is an excellent forum for pursuing new tools and new instruments so we can defend the Ahmadis wherever they live in the world. I think it's really important that countries stand up to this persecution and make it clear to governments, particularly in Pakistan, the world will not stand by. This is a human rights issue that needs to be better known and more action, urgent action taken on. Things are, my friends, really getting out of control. Things we've seen in recent weeks and days disturb me greatly. So this has been a very timely event, but I hope it will just be a stepping stone to more action globally, particularly the United Nations, so we can make our voices heard and protect our Ahmadi Muslim brothers and sisters. So thank you very much for coming today, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ahmed.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Elaine.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
If anybody want to stay, so they can discuss with each other. So if it's possible, we don't to close it. So
right.
If anybody want to discuss with Ahmed, if you have 5 minutes, anybody, Dave has a question.
Okay, sure. I have 5 minutes, no problem. But yeah.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Dave, can you put the question? Dave.
I think we lost Dave.
Okay.
Again,
just say.
Yeah, it's up here again.
Yes, try again. So if Dave is there, see if he was from Germany, you know, so he was helping the Ahmadis, as the Katrina mentioned. As the Katrina mentioned about the deportations, you know, so he's working a lot.
Yeah. No, I think in Germany's case, there is the option of utilizing the optional protocol to the Human Rights Covenant, under which there's something called, it's called, I think, emergency measure, or emergency measure, whereby the committee usually acts in 24 hours to tell any government concerned, you know,
not
to carry out the action if it will result in what's called irreversible, you know, harm to rights holder. So there are many cases in which deportation orders have been met with these sorts of orders by the committee. So that is one option. That's probably the most effective option, given the short time frames involved in this.
Thanks, Ahmed. I think.
All right. Okay. I have to go as well.
Yeah, I'll touch base with you afterwards, Ahmed.
Yeah, don't worry. It's okay. But thanks so much. It's been a great event.
Thank you, brother. Thank you very much. Razi, thank you. Rabia, thank you very much.
Razi, thank you so much. Hashmi and Thierry, thank you so much for the.
Thanks, Terry, for your cooperation. Razi. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Razi.
Thank you again. Hope it went well.
Yes. So now I am waiting for the chai from you.